Ray, given signs of strain in Israel's air defences and reliance on US support, how do you assess its current military position, and why does it still seem willing to push for another round of war?
Well, if you go back to when Vice President Vance was talking to Arachi, and he had the two real estate agents with him, monitoring what he said, I guess, he was on the phone, some people say 11 times, because the White House wanted to talk to him. And not only that, he was on another phone with Netanyahu because he was insisting on having an input, okay? And then when it was all done, and Vance said, we can't come to an agreement, even though they were actually, in Arachi's words, they were very close to an agreement. All of a sudden, the last telephone call says, no, throw the book at them, and they did. So who broke off the talks? The U.S. Actually, the Iranians fully expected to go the next day as well. So that was it. What did Vice President Vance do when he got on a plane? Who did he call? His wife? His kids? No, he called Netanyahu. Yeah, he said, this is the way it went, and he gave a full report. Vance says that. Netanyahu says that. And Netanyahu says, yeah, this is not unusual. He gave a very good report. The Americans give us a good report every day. And now the defense minister says, oh, we're waiting for a green light from Trump. My God, talk about chutzpah. Talk about not even disguising who's in control here or who the Israelis think are in control here. So would Israel flail out and, worst case, not only do a false flag attack, and if the U.S. didn't come in with both feet, then would they consider using nuclear weapons? As you know, I've always thought that the chances were greater than even that in extremis he would. I mean, a guy who does genocide, forced starvation, my God, why would he not use what he's got, right, before not only losing the war, but then going to jail, right? Okay. Now, I think that's what worries the Russians and worries the Chinese. My God, we can't tolerate this. No matter which way the wind is blowing, I mean, physically, we can't have the use of nuclear weapons. And that, I think, is why Putin and the Chinese have jumped in with both feet here. Now, Putin more dramatically with Arachi coming to Moscow. But I think they're really disturbed at this. And what does that mean? I think the Russians will try to persuade the Iranians, look, we know that you can finish off Israel. I mean, the Israelis might even know that now by virtue of the fact that you have all these hypersonic missiles and you've only used a couple of them. And you can, please don't do that just now. Please. Let's see if we can work something out, because God knows what Netanyahu is going to do if you do that. So the Iranians are very good negotiators and have a samut, a lot of what in Arab means steadfastness, right? They hang on there and they're willing to hang on for the duration. The Russians are the same way. And in extremis, in a situation where you have a person like Netanyahu and like Trump being the major actors here, totally unpredictable, that's the problem. Well, if Netanyahu decided to do that, that is, use nuclear weapons, do you think he'd ask Trump? My God, I don't know. Okay, let's say he does. Would Trump say, no, don't do that? I think he might. Would Netanyahu obey him? I think he might not. And I think the Kremlin is looking at it in those terms, and the Chinese as well. So I don't think they're out for blood, I think they're out for just winning this war and making it as easy as possible for not only Trump to back down, but the strait to be open and the Israelis to be assured that they're not going to be obliterated, pardon the word.
Ray, with tensions around the Strait of Hormuz pushing oil prices up again, does Trump have any real off-ramp from escalation, Or is he politically trapped?
Well, he has to be concerned about the price of gasoline. I mean, I'm told it's $8 a gallon in California, $5 a gallon around here in North Carolina. But, I wanted to say, he should have known that before this. He should have known that they could, but either he didn't or he said, no. The Mossad guy says, we got it all made. Let's just do it. It'll be really quick. So you're right. He's completely unpredictable, but there are signs that, some people are advising him, look, make this announcement on Sunday, so when the market opens on Monday, it won't be so bad. Make it the next Sunday, but so he's very sensitive to the market and to the price of oil. And, when you think about fertilizer, for God's sake, there are millions of people at risk now of not having enough food, mostly in the southern part of the hemisphere. So
I think Africa, nobody's talking about Africa, but the situation in Africa is dire as well.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And, there are people who care about Africa. Like BRICS cares about Africa. The Russians and the Chinese have been very much invested in bringing the anti-colonial past of Africa into the trash bin of history. So there are all these things working on Trump. His Secretary of the Treasury is as deranged a person as I've ever seen. He doesn't seem to get it. He was brought up thinking that the U.S. is a superpower and will always remain so. That's history. It ain't that way anymore. And when he makes these recommendations, these naive assumptions, it's crazy. You got Marco Rubio, you got Hegseth, my God. Maybe we talk about him later. And Vance as a weather vane, he's a windsock, he's in a tough position. He wants to be president. So does Rubio. And so how do they conduct themselves with the base? They have to. So, it's a very bad throwback to the situation before the attack on Iraq in 2003. I remember that so well. That's when we formed Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, January of 2003, because we saw that President Bush was being besieged by Cheney and Rumsfeld and this concocted intelligence that even the CIA didn't have the guts to move against, to sort of acquiesce in all these made-up tales about a nuclear weapon or weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So what happened? Well, we saw Colin Powell get up before the UN on the 5th of February, 2003, and we said, what are he going to do? And we saw that, and we were only 5 at the time. I was designated primary drafter, and we drafted him, and we got it out on the AFP wire by 5 o'clock that afternoon, telling the president, look, don't be deceived by all this stuff. This is crazy stuff. When Colin Powell says that there's a sinister nexus between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, what he's trying to do is say Saddam Hussein was responsible in part for 9/11, for God's sake. Now, we had to assume that Bush didn't know this. I suppose he knew it, but how you talk to the president without assuming that he's got some look. So at the end of that thing, we said, look, Mr. President, we strongly advise that you broaden the circle of your advisors beyond those clearly bent on a war for which we see no cogent reason, and from which the unintended consequences are likely to be catastrophic, period, end quote. Okay, what's my point? My point is that he had to expand his advisors beyond anyone, beyond the CIA that was playing the same game, for God's sake. They didn't have the lead anymore, but, they're going to face up to the vice president and used to visit them in the morning on his way to work. He lived right next to the CIA headquarters, my God. So were they going to do it? No. So they caved. Now, this time, Trump has this narrow circle of advisors. He admits it, He's got Rubio, he's got Hegseth, vice president, maybe, the Secretary of the Treasury, for God's sake. It affects Secretary of the Energy. I mean, they're all nobodies. They're all red hat Trump people, and they don't know from nothing. So that's the core of the problem. Will he have learned by now that the world is falling apart, literally? That people are going to be dying in millions because of the lack of fertilizer, the lack of other foodstuffs, and the price of oil and all that kind of stuff? Well, my God, a sensible person like me would say, oh, he's got to realize that within the next couple of weeks. But, I've been wrong before. And there is another element here, Nima. It bothers me greatly. We are celebrating 250 years. Terrific people that set up our country. Division of powers. Constitution that just won't quit and has been emulated everywhere in the world. Bill of Rights, okay? That's all been eroded now. The separation of powers. Congress has shown itself devoted to Israel above and beyond, and not willing to stop this war, evil though it has shown to, not even able to speak out against genocide, for God's sake, okay? So how does Trump, a narcissist like Trump, look at this? Well, I got this thing made. We're at the courts. I may get to appoint yet another justice. Don't worry about the courts, So he's got no rein on him. And so why does he feel confident to do these things? Isn't he afraid of the midterms? That's one of the logical assumptions I did in saying he'd never do these things. Well, apparently not. I mean, how do you explain him gratuitously getting into a fight with the Pope, for God's sake? Hello. I mean, to my great regret, 55% of us Catholics voted for Trump the last time around. Does he not give a patootie? Does he not really care? And if so, does he have other plans? Is he listening to people like Steve Bannon? Don't worry about the midterms. They can be postponed, or we can, regulate them. We can have ICE. Yeah, that would be a good idea. We can have ICE protect the ballots, or maybe even the National Guard. Now, just a little comment on use of the National Guard in this kind of role. There was a fellow named General Smedley Butler, who was a Marine general, came up from the ranks, and he got 2 medals of honor by enforcing Citibank and others' interests in the Caribbean and elsewhere in Latin America. When he got out, he said, "My God, what have I been doing? War is a racket." Okay, so David Swanson, a good friend of mine, has written a book about war is still a racket. Okay, and he takes Smedley Butler's unknown letters and speeches, in addition to his major one where he says war is a racket. Okay, war is a racket overseas, even though it's in the Caribbean and Latin America. It's also a racket at home. Now, why do I make that point? Because Smedley Butler in 1935 writes, "It is awful to use the National Guard to coordinate the activities of protesters and put them in a corral with barbed wire all around it. I've seen it done. It's unconscionable to use the National Guard in that role." 1935. Now, there are all kinds of warehouses being cleaned up and refurbished in our country in less populated areas. This is truth. I'm not making this stuff up, okay? And people asking why. Well, it may be that not you, Nima, but I may end up in one of those little coordination centers for speaking out that what seems likely now, in my view, with respect to the midterms. Will they take place? Will they be honest? Can they be defended? I'm not so sure. So this is just a long way of saying that if Trump doesn't give a rat's patootie about the midterm elections, that would help explain not only why he takes on the Pope, but why he's willing to tolerate the disdain of the whole rest of the world. Even Western Europe is coming against him. Georgia Maloney had a terrific critique of his critique of her, saying she's not a follower of Jesus. She's an insult for Jesus. And she comes back and she says, Jesus took care of the orphans and the widows and the refugees. Jesus liked peace, I'm not an insult to Jesus. You are. Anyhow, so things are coming to a point where one can't predict what Trump will do, but the stars, in my view, are aligning. And let me just add one other thing. Well, I guess I already mentioned that when Putin calls Trump, it's really important because Putin wants to warn Trump not to do something, okay? Now, I mentioned the Tomahawks, that he was supposed to be given to Ukraine, at least reportedly. What happened right after that? I think Trump said, well, let's have a summit. Let's have a summit. Let's talk about all this stuff. Now, that's the same as when Putin scared Joe Biden. Now, this goes back months before the Ukraine, before the Russians entered Ukraine. But there was a time when the U.S. was going to sail frigates into the Black Sea, okay? And Putin called Biden, he said, not a good idea. We can't be held responsible for what might happen to your frigates, your freaking frigates, as they go into the Black Sea. What did Biden do? He said, oh, okay, I got your word. He told the Navy to send those frigates to Greece, to have some sunbathing in the Aegean, not to go into the Black Sea. And then Biden said, hey, let's have a summit. I'm sure of that. I mean, it's a very odd set of circumstances. And they had this summit in June of 2021, right? And the bridal party from the U.S. side with Blinken and Nod and Sullivan and those guys showed themselves to be completely incompetent, because all we know about those talks was that Biden, before he got on the plane, said, I told Putin that we're aware that he's really under the gun, that the Chinese are squeezing him, that there's this very long border, I think several thousand miles between China and Russia. And China aspires not only to be the major economic power, but military. So we know that. I told Vladimir, I told him that we know you're being squeezed by China. Oh my God, so anyhow, summits don't have a real good reputation, but they have been used when the U.S., out of the blue, Biden first, and then Trump later, suggests, let's get together. And they do get together, and the Russians take the measure of the kind of advice Biden was getting. And now in Anchorage, the same thing, I think, happened. But there was some progress in Anchorage, and the Russians are trying to hold the U.S. to that. And to Trump's credit, at least he's not reneging on that. Part of this Ushakov readout says the U.S. and Russia pretty much agree on the fact that Zelensky is not the fly in the ointment, he's the impediment to peace in Ukraine, whereas the Europeans, they're aiding and abetting his worst instincts. So you have the Russians and the U.S. agreeing on Ukraine. Well, that's not like it was with respect to Biden, was it? And what does that mean? That means, and this is really hard for me to say, Russia wants the U.S. to stay in Europe. After a career of knowing that Russia wants the U.S. out of Europe, I've come to believe that in this set of circumstances, the U.S. can play the essential role in getting Russia's core interests taken into account with a new architecture for defense in Europe. It may not be possible, but at least that's what the Russians are holding out for. They don't want another attack from what will become Western Ukraine. They want some sort of regime that will make that unnecessary and impossible under the law, at least. So that's why, strange to say, the U.S. Russia wants the U.S. to stay in Europe, and Russia is gloating at the fact that NATO itself is sort of falling apart, and that people like Giorgia Meloni and the Spanish prime minister and so forth, they won't even let the U.S. use their bases, U.S. bases in their countries, to pursue this godforsaken war against Iran. So people say, oh, isn't Putin clever in splitting NATO? It's not Putin. It's Trump that's splitting NATO, for God's sake. And NATO is no longer in being, as far as I can tell. I saw that at the last NATO summit when Trump arrived a little late, and what was his name? Rutte, the Secretary General. Oh, Daddy's finally here. And then he found out that Daddy's a deadbeat, right? He doesn't pay child support. He doesn't pay alimony. You're free to buy stuff from Daddy, but he's not going to help you in Ukraine anymore. So NATO is no longer a real force. Article 5, in my view, no one can take that seriously, least of all the Estonians, Latvians, or Lithuanians. And if they stir up trouble with Russia, I think Putin will not attack them, but will make it clear that, their place in the sun is not attacking Russia, not even allowing Ukraine to attack Russia proper by overflowing their airspace with drones.